Ralph Henry. As he approaches his 80th birthday, he wanted to get the wisdom of his years of experience. And for those of you, some people, may be seeing it who don't know much about Ralph. He is one of the leading development economists from Trinidad and Tobago and from our region. And he has labored in the academic, educational, consultancy, and business sectors for going on nearly 60 years. His publication record is second to none. He has published extensively. His work with others in the Kyrie group showed that he understood the importance of putting economic theory to practice in our society and in our region. And it has enriched our insights and understanding of the challenges faced by many ordinary working class people across the English-speaking Caribbean. His work on economic development and policy choices, poverty, inequality, education, human resource development, social capital, culture, innovation, economic growth, and studies supporting business development represents just a sample of the toolbox that he has used, and the body of work that he has done. To me, he understood the importance of legacy and succession, and this is something that some of us have been talking quite a bit about for the succeeding generations. And I must say, and I must record the work of the late Carol Keller, Ralph, and others in Kyrie in setting up the Kyrie Knowledge Institute, because this is one of the institutions that serve this need. So basically, this conversation with Ralph is going to allow him, you're not going to hear me, I will just set the background, to give his reflections on some of the critical issues facing plural societies like ours in Trinidad and Tobago and in the region. I just want to quickly reflect on the situation where we are, currently in the global climate and where the Caribbean finds itself. We have had several issues in the past. One has been the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, which clearly showed in a lot of cases the failure of neoclassical and neoliberal economic policy, this whole laissez-faire free market. We have had moves towards a period of deglobalisation. We had a lot of talk about globalization, and now we are moving in the other direction, perhaps driven by the populism, right-wing nationalism, and the whole question of unequal distribution of incomes, because globalization perhaps affected certain sections of the population unequally. And then the other major thing that is we have to deal with is the economic center of the global economy is shifting, is moving towards China and India. So we are moving from a unipolar world into at least more than one, two polar, with the China, India, and the other, the BRICS group. On top of that, so that sets the scene internationally. We have also had, from an economic point of view, the global pandemic, the COVID-19, which perhaps, and Ralph will give his thoughts on that. The question here is, did it really reinforce the important role of the state? Because post-pandemic, a lot of us, developing countries, we are seeing increased poverty, cost of living increases, even here in the UK, and the demise of several businesses. So the war in Ukraine has also increased militarization around the Western world, and the rise of a new Cold War seems to be coming in. So we're having a new geopolitical assignment that is perhaps going to affect trade. So the question is, when we have to think about the Caribbean, we have to recognize the historical influences on us. We went through a period of slavery, indentureship, colonialism, the effect of racism, colonial education, neo-colonialism, neoliberalism. And some of the issues facing us are practical. Inequality has increased, and I'm sure Ralph will talk about that. Cost of living is a problem. Poor health outcomes in a lot of cases. Education inequality. Crime is probably one of the number one problem in Trinidad and Tobago, and crime affects economics. It affects, living, poverty, lack of growth, poor institutions. So the question, and before I pose my question, I'm going to put it in this frame. We have had a lot of work in the past, and I know Ralph would want to give homage to those who went before and those who have done work. Arthur Lewis, Lloyd Best, Carrie Leavitt, Gervin, Beckford, the Plantation School, Demas, McIntyre, Sincere, and many others have done work on this whole Caribbean economy and solving the problem. But we are still here today. We haven't solved the problem. Where have we gone wrong and why? That is one of the questions I have for Ralph now. And also, over his experience across the last 4 to 5 decades, what has gone right for the Caribbean? In what ways, in other words, in what ways has economic policy failed? Because transformation has seemed to have been proving to be a slippery and elusive adversary. So how can we achieve sustainable long-term economic growth and increase the welfare of everyone, of all our citizens? Striving and active community, health and welfare, poverty eradication. So I want to, so that is, I'm going to leave it, let Ralph now, give a kind of feedback of how he sees this whole question.
Yes. Thanks, Godfrey. You've given a little lecture in all that you've said. And I'm not going to give a lecture, but I'm going to, in a sense, reflect. Because getting to this age, I couldn't help but look back at the work that might have influenced my thinking over the years. And some of it, and some of the people, in my more youthful years, I kind of rejected some of the policy decisions that they came to. And now I sometimes tell myself I should ask for forgiveness, to be forgiven for having attacked them. And I want to refer in particular to Williams and Lewis, because to some extent they're like two peas in a pod. When you read Lewis's early work, remember Lewis was born in 1915. Williams was born in 1911. In the 1930s, Lewis wrote his little book, Labour in the West Indies. When you read Labour in the West Indies, you hear the young colonial who, having looked at the data, reviewed the history, says to himself, and puts it in script, look at these islands. They were the jewels in the British crown. And look at the poverty that exists all over these islands. People are destitute. People are living under horrible conditions. Large numbers of people on the plantations, in the towns. And he came up with an approach which was, all right, well, we have to deal with promotion of employment. We have to deal with equity. So when you read Lewis, you realize here's somebody attempting to correct for the inequality, and he talks about distribution and income distribution in that little book. You go forward a bit and look at the work of Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. But Williams had also written and had hosted a conference in the 1940s. Now remember, Williams was born in 1911. So he is 4 years older than Lewis. But you read Capitalism and Slavery, and people are only now giving him credit for it because the so-called other historians have been dismissive, etc. But that has been the basis for the whole argument about the need for reparations, capitalism and slavery. He showed how the British exploited labor on these estates, extracted literally everything that slaves could provide. You know, you use a slave, you work that slave, and life expectancy of slaves was no greater than 40 years of age. They're dispensable. And when you extracted everything from them and they died, you got another one. That was the nature of it. So you read the work of these these people. When Lewis came up with his treating with that legacy, he talked about industrialization of the British West Indies. Now, I am going to be 80 in a few days. I remember as a child living in Arima and going to Port of Spain and seeing that the first whiff and noticing that the first whiff of industry, as I reflect back on the place, was when you passed the biscuit factory in Mount Lambert, and the next whiff of industry was coconut growers which produce cooking oil, and then citrus growers, and then heavy industry would have been the foundry that dealt with the railway, you know, because at that time we had a railway, right? That was the industry. Trinidad was defined, was seen by Lewis as the most developed at the time, and the place where his model, he thought, would work, inviting foreign capital in, setting up industrial estates and creating jobs off the land, industrialization of the British West Indies. When you see what the British West Indies was, with Trinidad being the most developed at the time, and to put the word industrialization next to it, you know, he was wrongly condemned by the colonial authorities. What stupid idea you could have. The Caribbean, according to the Des Moines Commission, needed to reorganize its agriculture and keep going, you know, because you're already the tropical producer of primary products for the British Crown. So to put industrialization next to British West Indies was a radical idea. So when I started teaching at UWI, I couldn't line up behind the critique of Lewis, which in almost every class they use the best caricature of industrialization by invitation. And I said, well, yeah, might look so, but what was finally implemented was not what Lewis had proposed. Lewis proposed industry that will produce goods that will be exported outside of the region. What we had instead was import substitution. The people who got involved in quote-unquote industry, engaged in finishing touch industries, where they simply brought in products that were previously sold in the whole distribution system, brought it in, disassembled and in these industrial estates. So it's a straight import substitution in the local market. And that, in a study done, well, it's now almost 20 years ago, myself, Vanus James and Luan Barclay looked at to what extent we had firms that were geared to produce for export outside the region. And I doubt we found more than a dozen across the entire region. Most were producing. I remember sitting down and asking one of the big conglomerates in Trinidad, what do you export outside the region? And he didn't understand my question. And he said, well, we export, this is in Trinidad, we export to Jamaica. I said, no, outside the region. And he scratched his head and said, well, nothing. And that firm exists today, it's got bigger, but it's still engaged largely in importing for sale within the country. So in terms of that other side of the Lewis's model, which is that our people, our big guys, with a dozen of them, have learned the tricks of the trade of being able to produce for export. Now, you mentioned the names of a whole number of people who have contributed to the theory and the economic theorizing in the Caribbean. And of course, it includes Lewis, but it includes Best, Levitt, Gerben, Beckford, Dimas, etc. And again, on reflection, I could see that in my own work, both as an academic, but also as a practitioner, I have, in a sense, critiqued some of their work, but synthesized across the board from the ideas that they came up with. So I wouldn't regard myself as any trailblazer or as writing anything that is, earth-shattering in terms of economic theorizing in the region. Really, how do we synthesize all these ideas that have come from Lewis and industrialization with a view to really, dealing with this issue of inequality, which he recognized in his labor in the West Indies. Williams turning over capitalism and slavery and taking taking disused lands, ex-sugar lands, and converting it into an industrial estate geared to produce goods that if as he would have done, looked at industrialization of Britain, in Manchester and these places, he said, no, I am going to take the resources of this country, use the land of this country, and on an estate, lands where slaves and indentured workers worked and slaved and got the value of their labor extra from them by the British. I'm going to use this place and take, the oil and gas and convert it into heavy industry, and I'm going to suck it to them in their own markets with goods at the same level or better than what they produce. You could see a man who studied the Industrial Revolution in Britain and saw how the extraction of value from sugar and plantation agriculture with slavery, how they used that to industrialize capitalism and slavery. He's going to turn the thing around using the resources that this country had. So again, it's an important idea. Of course, one might question, as I did back then, selection of the industries. What we find in Trinidad is that Williams's philosophy, and this is where the failure is. Williams's philosophy is no longer current in the people who now run the country under the same party name that Williams established. Because when he attempted to industrialize using the oil and gas, etc., it was all part of what he called the development of a people's sector. And that people's sector, after the February Revolution, the Black Power Revolution in 1970, when he felt that the strategy that he had pursued, which was more or less taken as the Lewis approach, but which we know did not really line up with what Lewis had actually proposed. We had some industry, we had a number of industrial estates here in Jamaica and elsewhere, but it was not what Lewis actually proposed. Williams, correcting for that failure, because the Black Power riots started with large numbers of people not finding employment and seeing the discrimination that existed in terms of color and race in this country. And that's why Black Power resonated in Trinidad, but also in other parts of the Caribbean. Williams' renewed commitment to development came in 1970 after the Black Power riots, where he said, all right, we're going to create a people's sector. What is a people's sector? You attempted to develop economic structures that would allow for wide participation of all the people. You're treating with the issue of equity and equality and all of that, again, in these societies that had inherited a system of deep inequality. Going back, using things like the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is still very high, including in Trinidad, and across the Caribbean. So the people sector, the state engaged in businesses that the private sector was not willing to get into. They were concerned already with importing and making their money by selling whatever they import in the domestic economy. And when we set up Carifta and CARICOM, well, in the regional economy, but not really producing things that will be competitive in external economies. That's not their interest. It's to import and sell at home, or at best, with the region being an extension of that market. So the state was going to get involved in heavy industry, or industry where the domestic private sector was not interested in getting into. Williams set up what he called a small business industrial development corporation to provide finance to the little people. So people who could not get finance from the banking system as it was then, and maybe still is, you could get as an important source of finance for small and medium-sized enterprises. We didn't have those fancy words then of SMEs, but that's what it was about. So little people could get access and start developing industry, displaying their own entrepreneurship. The other component was cooperatives, and the whole cooperative sector was being promoted. Cultural cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. We had a number of consumer cooperatives that got established then, and also the credit unions. The mobilization of finance and the production under using cooperative principles, which and again will embrace the little people, everybody. You're mobilizing finance, a people's sector. And in respect of the state sector, it was expected that when these new industries would have, had their teething problems and gotten well established, that these industries would be privatized using a framework that allowed a whole lot of little people to participate in the ownership of these enterprises. So you set up something like the unit trust, an instrument for equity, for promotion of equity, reduction of inequality in the society. You look and speak to the people who are today running the state, running the government, and this idea of equity and equality doesn't ring, or if it rings at all, it rings hollow. And I think recently the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago made a comment that he has to ensure a system where the rich people can have their riches protected, and technically he's almost saying that he wants the 1% to get richer, because he felt, I think mistakenly, that they will provide the jobs. I'm not so sure of that, and the historical evidence about that is there's not very much evidence of their providing, being concerned with the provision and creating jobs. So we still we moved Williams like philosophy, and Williams towards the end of his life kind of hinted that he's not sure his model had worked, because he recognized, and he made a statement, and Selwyn Ryan and Luan Barclay used as a title for a book, The Sharks are eating the sardines. The private sector that had emerged through SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, these new firms were being gobbled up by the big guys. So the big guys have remained in control, and you have the conglomerates. And now you hear concerns being raised by some of the people who are running these conglomerates that they don't particularly like. I've heard one top person in the chamber here made a comment: the government should get out any state enterprise that they now have. Well, if they get out of these state enterprises, to whom are these state enterprises going to be sold? The model that this guy has, and perhaps he's very influential among the political elite here, the model is really that it's the conglomerates, the big guys will be the ones to whom these state enterprises would be sold. So the idea of equality and equity technically has gone through the window. So in terms of our failure and our things going wrong, it has to do with the fact that I don't know that the ideological base that one saw as the backdrop for or as influencing the early work of both of Lewis and Williams, which sometimes we see Best as and Levitt and those who came after as really discarding everything about Lewis and Williams. But when you read between the lines, you can see that there's not much of while the critique might seem to be radical, the objectives and the ideological position is not vastly different. Williams might have dismissed socialism, but others will say, well, having such a large state sector is a socialist in orientation. Surely Williams did not go in the direction of Burnham, so he recognized that there's need to have a system of it where you can have a private sector, a dynamic private sector. Unfortunately, the private sector may look dynamic, the large-scale private sector may look dynamic, but actually it's still very much in the mode that it was when Lewis wrote in the 1940s.